£50,000. That was the exact price of Beatrice's life. Her stepmother hadn't even bothered to negotiate, sliding the marriage contract across the mahogany desk with the casual disdain of a butcher weighing cheap meat. The Duke of Westfall was ruined, half-mad, and locked away in a crumbling northern fortress. He needed a bride. Lady Agatha needed her gambling debts quietly erased. Beatrice was simply the easiest asset to liquidate. She didn't cry. Tears, after all, held no market value. The drawing room smelled of beeswax, stale lavender, and impending betrayal. Beatrice stood by the unlit hearth, her hands neatly folded over the faded grey wool of her day dress. She had learned long ago that stillness was the best armor against Lady Agatha. If you did not move, if you did not speak, you offered no target. But today, stillness would not save her. Agatha sat behind the heavy oak desk that had once belonged to Beatrice's father. She was a woman who maintained her beauty with the ruthless efficiency of a military campaign. Even now, facing financial ruin, her posture was impeccable. She tapped a fingernail against a thick sheaf of parchment. "You are 24, Beatrice," Agatha said. Her voice was flat, devoid of malice. Malice required passion. Agatha operated purely on mathematics. "You are plain. You possess no dowry, no connections, and a disposition that I can only describe as dreadfully tiresome. You have been a drain on my resources for 10 years. Beatrice said nothing. She looked at the parchment. "Lord Alistair, the Duke of Westfall, requires a wife," Agatha continued, pushing the papers an inch forward. "He has offered to absorb the entirety of the estate's debts. In exchange, you will marry him. The carriage arrives in an hour. Pack your things." A cold spike of adrenaline finally shattered Beatrice's practiced calm. "Westfall," she repeated. The name tasted like ash. Everyone in London knew the stories of Westfall. 5 years ago, a fire had gutted his ancestral home, claiming the lives of his elder brother and his father. Alistair had survived, though society whispered he had started the blaze himself in a fit of jealous rage. He had vanished to the north, a pariah, leaving his London properties to rot. He was ruined. A monster living in a shell of a house. "He is a murderer, Agatha," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He is a duke," Agatha corrected sharply. "And more importantly, he is solvent. Do you think I want this? Do you think I enjoy sending my late husband's daughter to freeze in Northumberland? I do not care enough about you to wish you harm, Beatrice. I simply need to survive. If I do not clear these debts, Cecily will have no season. We will be out on the street, Cecily." Of course, it always came back to her beautiful, empty-headed stepsister. Beatrice looked at the woman who had systematically dismantled her life since her father's death. There was no triumph in Agatha's eyes. Just the weary, hard stare of a survivor kicking someone else off the lifeboat. "An hour," Beatrice said. "Take the heavy trunks," Agatha replied, looking back down at her ledger. "I am told it is remarkably damp in the north." Beatrice walked upstairs. Her bedroom was on the 4th floor, tucked beneath the eaves where the servants used to sleep, before Agatha had dismissed half of them to pay the dressmakers. She pulled a battered leather valise from beneath the narrow bed. She did not pack keepsakes. She had none left. Agatha had sold her mother's jewelry years ago. Beatrice packed thick wool stockings, sensible shifts, a heavy traveling cloak, and 3 books. She moved mechanically. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Panic would not change the ink on the contract downstairs. Cecily hovered in the doorway, wringing her delicate, pale hands. "Bea? Are you truly going? Mother says you're to be a duchess." Beatrice looked up. Cecily wasn't cruel. She was just entirely shielded from the brutal reality of the world they lived in. Yes, Cecily. I am to be a duchess. Will you wear diamonds? Cecily asked, her eyes wide. I imagined so, Beatrice lied. She closed the valise and fastened the brass buckles with a sharp snap. Be careful with your mother, Cecily. When she runs out of things to sell, she will eventually sell you. Cecily blinked, uncomprehending. Beatrice pushed past her, carrying her own bag down the narrow stairs. The journey north took 4 days. It was a brutal, bone-rattling progression away from civilization. The manicured green hills of the south gradually gave way to jagged stone, bruised purple skies, and moors that stretched out like open wounds. Beatrice sat in the corner of the hired carriage, wrapped in her cloak, watching the rain lash against the glass. She did not weep. She calculated. Westfall was a ruined man. If he was Maud, she would learn to manage him. If he was violent, she would learn to hide. She had spent a decade surviving Agatha. She was uniquely qualified in the art of making herself small, useful, and unbothered. She was a commodity, a transaction. She just needed to figure out what the Duke of Westfall expected for his £50,000. Westfall Abbey did not appear on the horizon. It loomed out of the fog like the carcass of a great, dead beast. Beatrice leaned against the carriage window, her breath fogging the cold glass. The estate was massive, a sprawling Gothic nightmare of black stone and narrow windows. The rumors of the fire had not been exaggerated. The entire east wing was a skeletal ruin, its roof gone, the blackened chimneys pointing toward the heavy sky like accusing fingers. The carriage lurched to a halt in the courtyard. There were no footmen to open the door. The gravel was choked with weeds. Beatrice sat for a moment, listening to the wind howl through the hollow stones of the ruined wing. She pushed the heavy carriage door open herself and stepped out into the freezing mud. The heavy oak front door groaned open. A man stood in the threshold. He was ancient, his livery frayed at the cuffs, holding a flickering lantern that barely cut through the gloom. "Your Grace," the old man rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves. "I am Franks. Welcome to Westfall." Beatrice hauled her valise out of the carriage. "Thank you, Franks. Is there a fire inside?" "In the library, Your Grace. The master is waiting." The interior of Westfall Abbey was a mausoleum. The entrance hall was stripped bare. Faded rectangles on the silk-paneled walls marked where grand portraits had once hung. The air was colder inside than it had been in the courtyard, smelling of damp plaster, old wood, and wet ashes. Franks led her down a long, echoing corridor. He pushed open a heavy mahogany door. The library was cavernous. Bookshelves reached up to a vaulted ceiling, but half the shelves were empty. At the far end of the room, a meager fire sputtered in a massive hearth. Standing by the fire, with his back to her, was Alistair, the Duke of Westfall. He did not turn around when she entered. "Leave us, Franks," he said. His voice was low, rough, like stone grinding against stone. The door clicked shut behind her. Beatrice stood in the center of the room, her wet cloak dripping onto the scuffed hardwood floor. She waited. Alistair finally turned. He was not the snarling monster the London gossip sheets had painted him to be. He was just a man who looked like he had not slept in half a decade. He was tall, dressed in a plain, dark coat that had seen better days. His dark hair was roughly cut, but it was his face that caught the dim light. The left side of his jaw and neck was a road map of silvery, puckered burn scars disappearing beneath his collar. His eyes were a startling, icy grey. They swept over her, clinical and detached. "You survived the roads," he said. "I am not made of glass, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite the shiver racking her spine. Alistair let out a short, humorless breath. "Good. Glass shatters here. He walked over to a heavy desk strewn with papers and poured a measure of amber liquid into a single glass. He didn't offer her one. He drank it neat. "I suppose you expect an apology for the state of your new home." "I expect nothing," Beatrice said. "My stepmother made it quite clear that this was a transaction. You paid a premium. I am here to fulfill my end of the contract." Alistair paused, the glass halfway to the desk. He looked at her, really looked at her this time. The cynical detachment in her voice seemed to surprise him. "She told you I bought you. She told me you absorbed her debts. The phrasing is irrelevant. The result is the same." Beatrice unclasped her wet cloak and draped it over the back of a leather chair. She walked closer to the meager fire, desperate for its heat. "So let us dispense with the awkwardness, Your Grace. What do you require of me? An heir? A nursemaid? A victim for your madness?" Alistair's jaw tightened. The scars on his neck pulled taut. He set the glass down with a heavy thud. "I am not mad, Beatrice, and I do not want an heir to inherit a graveyard. Then why am I here?" He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The wind battered against the tall library windows, rattling the loose panes. "The vicar is waiting in the chapel," Alistair said, ignoring her question. "We will be married tonight. You will find your rooms in the west corridor. Franks will show you." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers. He smelled of rain, smoke, and cheap whiskey. He stopped at the door, his hand on the brass knob. "Lock your door tonight, Beatrice," he said softly, without looking back. "The wind plays tricks in this house, and I do not want you wandering." He left her standing by the dying fire. The wedding was an exercise in bleak utility. The chapel smelled of mildew. The local vicar, a terrified man who kept glancing at Alistair's scars, rushed through the vows as if reading a death warrant. Beatrice wore her damp travel dress. Alistair wore his scowl. There was no ring. He slid a plain, tarnished silver band onto her finger. It was cold. When it was over, Franks led her to a large, draughty bedchamber. A small fire had been lit, but it barely dented the chill. On the vanity sat an iron key. Beatrice picked it up. She walked to the heavy door, turned the key in the lock, and listened to the heavy clack of the tumbler. She stood alone in the dark, a duchess of a ruined castle, married to a man who didn't want her, sold by a woman who didn't care. For the first time since the mahogany desk in London, Beatrice sat on the edge of the large empty bed, buried her face in her cold hands, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to cry. Then she dried her eyes. Tomorrow she would get to work. Survival was entirely a matter of inventory. By her 3rd day at Westfall Abbey, Beatrice had assessed the full extent of the disaster. The estate was not merely neglected, it was bleeding out. Frank, she discovered, was one of only 4 servants remaining. There was a cook who was mostly blind, a scullery maid who was practically a child, and a stable hand who slept in the hay. They lived on boiled potatoes, tough mutton, and weak tea. The grand rooms were covered in dust sheets. The roof in the main hall leaked, creating a permanent, freezing puddle on the marble tiles. Alistair was a ghost. He disappeared before dawn, riding out onto the moors, and returned long after dark. He locked himself in the library, the only room he seemed to care about. They did not eat together. They did not speak. Beatrice could have stayed in her room, shivering under the thin blankets, waiting for the misery to swallow her. But idleness bred despair, and Beatrice despised despair. On the 4th morning, she found the estate ledgers. They were piled haphazardly in a small, freezing antechamber off the main hall, abandoned. Beatrice wrapped a heavy wool shawl around her shoulders, dragged a chair to the desk, and opened the first book. It took her 6 hours to decipher Alistair's frantic, scrawling handwriting. When she finally understood the numbers, she sat back, rubbing her temples. It made no sense. Agatha had told her Alastair was bankrupt. The state of the abbey confirmed it. Yet the ledgers told a different story. The Westfall estate was deeply indebted. Yes, mortgages piled upon mortgages by Alastair's late father. But 3 weeks ago, a massive influx of capital had been moved, £50,000, but it hadn't gone to Lady Agatha. Beatrice traced the ink with a trembling finger. The money had been transferred to a banking firm in London, explicitly to purchase the promissory notes held against the late Viscount, Beatrice's father. Agatha hadn't sold Beatrice for money. Alastair had bought Agatha's leverage. He essentially owned Lady Agatha. He had held her complete financial ruin over her head and traded that leverage for one specific asset, Beatrice. But why? If he had £50,000, which he clearly possessed, likely from an untouchable entail or a private trust, why not fix the roof? Why not hire servants? Why not rebuild the East Wing? Why spend a fortune to extort a cruel stepmother for a penniless plain spinster? She closed the ledger with a sharp crack that echoed in the small room. She needed answers. She found Alastair in the stables. He was brushing down a massive, ill-tempered black gelding himself. His coat was off, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marred by more of the silvery burn scars. He looked up as she stepped into the dimly lit barn. "The house is falling apart, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the smell of hay and manure. Alastair continued brushing the horse. "I am aware. We are eating rotting potatoes and the roof is caving in." "I am aware." "Then why?" Beatrice demanded, stepping closer, ignoring the gelding as it stamped its massive hoof. "Did you spend £50,000 on me instead of timber and coal?" Alastair's hand stopped. He slowly turned to face her. The icy grey eyes were hard, unyielding. "You have been in my papers. Someone has to be," Beatrice shot back. "They were lying in the dust. You bought my stepmother's debts. You extorted her. She would have given you Cecily for half that price. Cecily is beautiful. Cecily is meant to be a duchess. Why did you demand me?" The silence in the barn stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the horse. Alastair tossed the brush into a wooden bucket. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands, his gaze locked on her. "Do you think I need beauty in this place, Beatrice? Look around you." He gestured sharply to the crumbling stone walls of the stable. "Beauty dies here. Beauty freezes. I didn't want your sister. If I brought a delicate London flower to Westfall, she would have thrown herself off the parapets within a week." He took a step toward her. He was massive, imposing, carrying the scent of hard labor and bitter frost. Beatrice forced herself not to step back. "2 months ago," Alastair said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble, "I met with your stepmother's solicitor in London to discuss buying a piece of land your father owned in the valley. The solicitor accidentally showed me the household accounts of your London residence." Beatrice frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with—" "Everything," Alastair interrupted. "Your stepmother is a fool who spends money on silk and gin. But the ledgers— someone was keeping that house from capsizing. Someone was stretching £100 to do the work of 500. Someone was negotiating with the coal merchants, rationing the flour, holding the creditors at bay with sheer mathematical brutality. I recognized the handwriting in the margins." He stopped, standing mere inches from her. Beatrice looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It was your handwriting, Beatrice," Alastair said softly. "You kept that miserable family afloat for a decade while they treated you like dirt." I had to," Beatrice whispered. "It was survival." "Exactly," Alastair said. The hardness in his eyes cracked, just a fraction, revealing a desperate, bone-deep exhaustion. "I am drowning, Beatrice. My father ruined this estate, and my brother burned half of it to the ground. The vultures in London are waiting for me to fail so they can strip the land. I don't need a wife. I don't need a lover." He reached out. For a second, Beatrice thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his rough, scarred fingers lightly tapped the center of her chest. "I need a survivor," he whispered. "I need a crowbar. I need someone who knows how to hold the line when the roof is caving in. That is why I bought you, because you are the only woman in England tough enough to help me save this house." Beatrice did not slap him. She did not swoon, nor did she dissolve into indignant tears at the revelation that her marriage was merely an aggressive recruitment strategy. She stared at the Duke of Westfall, smelling the harsh scent of damp earth and horses that clung to him, and felt a strange, terrifying sensation bloom in her chest. It was not romance. Romance was a fiction peddled to women who could afford to be soft. It was validation. For 10 years, Lady Agatha had treated Beatrice's mind as an inconvenient defect. Her ability to calculate grain yields, her ruthless negotiation with the London butcher, her quiet, desperate juggling of a dozen overdue bills, these were considered the vulgar habits of a spinster who did not know her place. Alistair did not see a plain, burdensome stepdaughter. He saw a weapon. He had paid £50,000 for her mind. "A crowbar," Beatrice repeated slowly. The word felt solid in her mouth, useful, heavy. "If the word offends you, I can lie and tell you I was captivated by your portrait," Alistair said, his voice flat, though the tight line of his jaw betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "I have no portrait. Agatha sold the frame and burned the canvas for firewood 3 winters ago," Beatrice replied. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The barn was freezing, but the cold suddenly felt less like an executioner and more like an opponent. "If I am to be your crowbar, your grace, I require leverage. I cannot hold the line if I do not control the perimeter." Alistair narrowed his eyes. Meaning I need the keys," Beatrice said. She stepped toward him, closing the distance he had established. "All of them. To the pantries, the cellars, the strong boxes, and the sealed rooms. I need the authority to fire whoever is stealing from you, because I have seen the provisions and someone is definitely skimming the flour. And I need you to sign a document granting me power of attorney over the domestic accounts. I will not have my orders countermanded by a stable hand who thinks a woman cannot read a ledger." Alistair looked down at her. He was a foot taller, a wall of scarred muscle and grim exhaustion. A slow, rusty sound escaped his chest. It took Beatrice a moment to realize it was a laugh. "Franks!" Alistair shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent courtyard. The old man appeared in the barn doorway a moment later, clutching his lantern. "Your Grace, give the Duchess the master ring," Alistair ordered, turning back to his horse. "Every key in the house, and tell the staff, what remains of them, that her word is now law. If she tells you to tear down the west wall, I expect to see you with a hammer." Franks blinked, his rheumy eyes widening, but he reached into his frayed coat and produced a heavy iron ring loaded with brass and iron keys. He handed it to Beatrice with a trembling hand. The metal was freezing. Beatrice gripped it tightly. "Where do you begin?" Alistair asked, not looking at her as he resumed brushing the gelding. "I begin by sealing this house," Beatrice said, turning on her heel. "We are heating 40 empty rooms. By nightfall, we will be heating 4. You will sleep in the chamber next to mine in the central corridor. We will share the heat from a single chimney stack. And tomorrow, I am going into the village. We need coal, and I intend to find out who is willing to sell it to a ruined duke. She didn't wait for his permission. She walked out of the barn, her boots sinking into the freezing mud. She had a job to do. The next 3 weeks were a brutal, systematic war against entropy. Beatrice moved through Westfall Abbey, not as a bride, but as a commanding officer. She dragged thick, moth-eaten tapestries out of storage and nailed them over the draughty windows in the central corridor. She ordered Franks and the scullery maid, a terrified girl named Mary, to haul mattresses into the library. If Alistair insisted on spending his nights working at his desk, he would do so, in the one room Beatrice had decided was worth heating. She audited the kitchen. She found the blind cook hoarding salt and the stable boy smuggling out oats. She did not fire them. She simply docked their wages, locked the pantries, and informed them that the next theft would result in the magistrate. They hated her, but they worked. Then came the village. The locals of Oakhaven despised Westfall. They remembered the fire. They remembered the screaming. They believed Alistair was cursed. When Beatrice walked into the local coal merchant's office, the man practically spat at her feet. "No credit for the Abbey," Mr. Higgins grunted, crossing his thick arms. "The Duke owes me for 3 tons from 5 years ago." Beatrice stood by his desk, dressed in her plain grey wool, the heavy iron keyring clinking at her waist. "I am not asking for credit, Mr. Higgins. I am auditing his old debts. Show me the receipt." Higgins sneered, digging into a drawer and slapping a faded piece of paper on the desk. Beatrice scanned it. "This is signed by the late Duke, Alistair's father," she noted, her voice crisp. "And it is for low-grade slate coal, not the anthracite you charged him for. You overcharged a dying man, Mr. Higgins. By my calculation, factoring in standard market rates for the year 1820, you owe the Westfall estate precisely £4 and 12 shillings. The merchant turned purple. "You insolent—" "I will waive the debt," Beatrice cut in, her eyes hard. "In exchange, you will deliver 1 ton of good, clean-burning coal to the Abbey by tomorrow morning. If you do not, I will take this receipt to the magistrate in York and have your ledger books seized for fraud. Do we have an understanding?" Higgins stared at her. He saw no bluff in her pale, sharp face. He swallowed hard and nodded. When Beatrice returned to the Abbey, the first load of coal was already burning in the library hearth. Alistair was sitting at the desk, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, rubbing soot from her cheek. "Higgins sent coal," Alistair said, his voice ragged. "He hasn't delivered to this house in 5 years. How did you manage it?" Beatrice walked to the fire, peeling off her frozen gloves. She held her aching hands out to the flames. The heat was a physical shock, painful and glorious. "I read his old invoices," Beatrice said simply. "I found leverage. I used it." Alistair watched her. The firelight flickered across his scarred face, softening the harsh lines of his jaw. "You are ruthless, Beatrice." "I am warm," Beatrice corrected, turning to look at him. "Ruthlessness is merely a tool. Tomorrow, we will look at the tenant farm leases. It is time we collected what is owed to you." December arrived, not with a whisper, but with an axe. The blizzards swept down from the Scottish borders, burying Westfall Abbey in 3 feet of snow. The world beyond the heavy oak doors ceased to exist. They were entirely isolated, a small garrison holding out in a crumbling fortress. The brutal cold forced a physical intimacy that neither Beatrice nor Alistair had prepared for. Beatrice's plan to consolidate their living quarters was the only reason they didn't freeze to death in their beds. They inhabited only the library, the adjoining parlour, and their 2 small adjacent bedchambers. They took their meals together in the library, sitting on opposite sides of the massive desk, chewing on tough salted beef and stale bread. They rarely spoke of anything but logistics, rations, coal reserves, the structural integrity of the roof. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind screamed against the glass and the house groaned like a dying ship. The silence between them changed. It lost its hostility. It became a shared trench. One night, a week before Christmas, the temperature dropped so drastically that the water in the pitcher on Beatrice's washstand froze solid, splitting the ceramic with a sharp crack. She woke with a start, her breath pluming white in the darkness of her bedroom. Shivering violently, she wrapped her heavy wool cloak over her nightgown and hurried into the library. The fire had burned down to embers. Alistair was not in his bedchamber. He was in the library, pacing. He was in his shirt sleeves, oblivious to the freezing air. His hands were clenched in his hair, his chest heaving as if he had just run 10 miles. In the dim red glow of the embers, the scars on his neck and jaw looked angry and inflamed. "Alistair," Beatrice called out softly. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. He spun around. His eyes were wide, wild, and unseeing. He was trapped somewhere else. "The stairs are gone," he choked out, his voice raw with panic. "The roof is coming down. I can't reach him. God, the smoke!" He was reliving the fire. Beatrice did not hesitate. She didn't approach him with soft, placating murmurs. She knew from experience that a drowning man would only pull you under if you gave him something soft to grab. He needed something solid. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and slammed it against the stone fireplace. Clang! The sharp, metallic noise echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Alistair flinched, blinking rapidly. His gaze snapped to her, the wildness slowly draining away, replaced by a devastating, hollow exhaustion. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the heavy desk, and sank into his leather chair. Beatrice set the poker down. She walked to the woodbox, threw 3 heavy logs onto the embers, and worked the bellows until a fresh, hungry flame leapt up. Only then did she turn to him. He was shivering now, the cold finally registering. She walked to the small sideboard, poured a generous measure of their carefully rationed brandy into a glass, and brought it to him. "Drink," she commanded. He took the glass with a shaking hand and swallowed the liquor in one gulp. He closed his eyes, his head falling back against the leather chair. "You should not have seen that," he whispered hoarsely. "I have seen a great deal in my life, Alistair. A nightmare will not break me." Beatrice pulled a chair close to the desk and sat down, drawing her cloak tighter. "Your scars are aching in the cold. It disrupts your sleep. It isn't the scars that keep me awake," he said bitterly. He opened his eyes and looked at the roaring fire. "It is the sound. I hear the timber cracking. I hear him screaming." Beatrice knew the rumors. Society whispered that Alistair had set the fire to inherit the title. She looked at the man in front of her, a man who worked himself to the bone, who lived on nothing, who had bought her not for pleasure, but for her strength. "Tell me what happened," she said. Her voice was not a plea. It was an instruction. Alistair looked at her. Her face was pale, framed by loose, dark hair, illuminated by the firelight. There was no pity in her eyes. Pity was useless. There was only a fierce, unyielding attention. "My brother Thomas was mad," Alistair said quietly. The words felt heavy, dusted off after years of being buried. Not eccentric. Mad. He believed the walls were whispering to him. My father refused to send him to an asylum. He locked him in the East Wing. Alistair stared into the flames. One night, Thomas decided the only way to silence the whispers was to burn them out. He set his mattress on fire. The old wood went up like kindling. I woke to the smell of smoke. I tried to get to him. The main staircase collapsed as I reached the landing. The burning timber pinned me. I had to rip my own flesh away to get out. He touched the scarred side of his face mechanically. My father rushed in after him. Neither of them came out. I lay on the lawn, smelling my own burning skin, watching my inheritance turn to ash And when the smoke cleared, the men in London, the creditors, the vultures, they smiled. Because a ruined, scarred pariah is easy to pick clean. He looked at Beatrice, his grey eyes bleak. That is the grand tragedy of Westfall. No murder, no jealous rage. Just a madman, a fool, and a survivor who doesn't know how to quit. Beatrice sat in silence. The wind howled outside, throwing snow against the tall windows. She stood up. She walked around the desk. She didn't offer him a comforting embrace. Instead, she reached out and took his cold, shaking hand in hers. Her grip was firm, calloused from the hard work of the past weeks. "Then we will not quit," she said. Her voice was a steady drumbeat in the quiet room. "The vultures will starve outside our gates, Alistair. We are going to fix the roof. We are going to balance the ledgers. And we are going to survive the winter." Alistair looked down at her small hand, gripping his massive one. He held on tightly, anchoring himself to her pragmatic, relentless strength. "Yes, Beatrice," he murmured, the tremor leaving his voice. "We will." The thaw came in late February, turning the frozen moors into a treacherous sea of black mud. And with the mud came the carriage from London. Beatrice was in the antechamber, her fingers stained with ink as she tallied the spring planting costs, when Franks shuffled in. His face was pale. "Your Grace," he mumbled, "a gentleman is here. A Mr. Pendleton, from the London Mercantile Bank. He says he has an appointment with the Duke." Beatrice closed the ledger. "The Duke is in the high pasture, repairing the sheep fences. Put Mr. Pendleton in the library. Do not offer him tea. Let him feel the chill." She took 10 minutes to wash the ink from her hands and smooth her practical grey skirts. She did not change into anything grander. She wanted the solicitor to see exactly who he was dealing with. When Beatrice entered the library, Mr. Pendleton was standing by the hearth, shivering in his fine wool coat. He was a sleek, well-fed man, with sharp eyes that catalogued every water stain on the ceiling and every frayed edge of the rug. He turned, offering a condescending smile. "Ah, you must be the new Duchess. My condolences on the draft, Your Grace. I am here to see your husband regarding the overdue mortgages on the southern acreage." "You will speak to me, Mr. Pendleton," Beatrice said, walking to the desk and taking Alistair's heavy leather chair. She didn't invite him to sit. Pendleton chuckled, a dry, patronizing sound. "I assure you, Your Grace, this is a matter of complex financial. You represent the consortium holding the notes on the Oakhaven Valley lands," Beatrice interrupted smoothly. "Notes that were issued at an extortionate 12% interest rate by my late father-in-law, a rate that is currently in violation of the usury laws of 1714, considering the land's assessed value at the time of signing." Pendleton's chuckle died in his throat. His smile vanished. Beatrice opened a drawer and pulled out a thick file of papers. "I have audited the estate's debt, Mr. Pendleton. I know exactly what we owe. More importantly, I know exactly where your bank has overstepped its legal bounds. You have come here expecting to foreclose on the southern acreage because you assume my husband is too broken, too mad, and too poor to fight you in chancery." She leaned forward, tapping the file. "You are wrong. We will not hand over the land. We will challenge the original assessment of the mortgage. And if you attempt to force a foreclosure, I will personally ensure that every piece of correspondence detailing your bank's predatory lending practices to a man suffering from dementia, the late Duke, is published in the London Times." Pendleton stared at her, genuinely shocked. You cannot be serious. The Duke does not have the funds for a protracted legal battle. We do not need funds to destroy your bank's reputation, Mr. Pendleton. We only need the truth, ink, and a very loud voice. Beatrice stood up, her posture rigid. Here is my counter-offer. You will restructure the loan to a flat 4% interest. You will forgive the penalties accrued over the last 5 years. In exchange, we will resume regular, quarterly payments starting this spring. If you refuse, I will see you in court, and I will make it the most expensive, embarrassing ordeal of your career. The library door opened with a loud creak. Alistair stood in the doorway. He was covered in mud, his boots heavy with the moor dirt, a heavy coil of wire slung over his broad shoulder. He looked massive, savage, and entirely unbothered by the elegant London solicitor standing in his domain. He walked into the room, his icy grey eyes locking onto Pendleton, who instinctively took a step back. "Is there a problem here, Beatrice?" Alistair asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "No, Alistair," Beatrice said calmly, keeping her eyes on the solicitor. "Mr. Pendleton was just leaving. He is returning to London to draft a new contract for our southern acreage, a fair contract." Alistair looked from Beatrice to the terrified solicitor. He saw the file on the desk. He saw the rigid set of Beatrice's shoulders. And slowly, the corner of his scarred mouth tipped upward into a genuine, fierce smile. "I see," Alistair said. He stepped aside, leaving the door wide open. "You heard my wife, Pendleton. The roads are muddy. I suggest you leave before dark." Pendleton swallowed hard, grabbed his hat, and practically fled from the room, his boots clattering, echoing down the empty hall. When the front door slammed shut, silence descended on the library. Alistair dropped the wire onto the floor. He walked over to the desk, looking down at Beatrice. He didn't look at her like she was a crowbar anymore. He looked at her like she was a miracle. 4%? He asked softly. "He will agree to it," Beatrice said, her adrenaline slowly ebbing. "He is a coward, and cowards hate public scrutiny. We just saved the Southern Valley." Alistair leaned over the desk. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was warm. "When I bought your stepmother's debts," Alistair murmured, his eyes searching hers, "I thought I was buying a manager. I thought I was buying a survivor." Beatrice held her breath, leaning imperceptibly into his touch. "And what did you buy, Alistair?" "A partner," he said fiercely, "an absolute equal." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a polite, tentative kiss of a stranger. It was desperate, hard, and deeply grateful. It tasted of rain, cold air, and the sudden, undeniable promise of spring. Beatrice kissed him back, her hands gripping the lapels of his muddy coat, anchoring him to her, anchoring them both to the life they were pulling from the ruins. Spring didn't arrive at Westfall Abbey with gentle breezes and blossoming flowers. It arrived with violence. The snowmelt turned the moors into a treacherous bog. The roof of the ruined east wing finally collapsed entirely under the weight of the shifting ice, sending a thunderous crash echoing through the valley that made Alistair drop his tea and grab the iron poker, his eyes wide and unseeing for 10 agonizing seconds. Beatrice had simply walked over, pried the poker from his rigid fingers and said, "It is only the old slate, Alistair. Now we do not have to pay the demolition crew to tear it down." He had blinked, the frantic terror in his chest dissolving into a rough, startled laugh. They did not speak of the kiss in the library. They did not need to. It had shifted the axis of their survival. They were no longer 2 hostages trapped in a freezing fortress. They were a garrison preparing for an offensive. By April, the 4% interest rate Beatrice had extorted from Mr. Pendleton freed up exactly £300 in the quarterly budget. Beatrice did not spend it on curtains or a new carriage. She spent it on timber, limestone, and wages. She walked into Oakhaven Village on a Tuesday, her boots coated in thick grey mud. She marched straight into the local tavern, where the unemployed men of the village spent their meager coins on watered-down ale. The room went dead silent as she stood in the doorway, the heavy iron keyring still clipped to her plain wool skirt. "I need masons," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying over the smoky air. "I need carpenters. I need labourers who are not afraid of hard work and heights. The Duke is rebuilding the main hall roof. We pay £1 a day, guaranteed, every Friday at sunset. And a hot meal at noon." A burly man near the hearth spat into the fire. "Westfall money is cursed. The Duke is mad. The Duke is currently digging out a drainage trench in the north pasture with his own 2 hands, Beatrice replied coolly, not blinking. "His money is minted by the Crown, exactly like anyone else's. And unless you have a sudden influx of employment from the sheep, I suggest you present yourselves at the Abbey courtyard tomorrow at dawn. Bring your own hammers." She turned and left. The next morning, 12 men stood in the freezing mud of the courtyard. Alistair looked out the library window at the ragged line of labourers. He was holding a cup of chicory coffee, his jaw tight. "They hate me, Beatrice. They think I burned my family alive. They are hungry," Beatrice said, not looking up from the ledger where she was already calculating the week's wage distribution. "Hunger always beats superstition. Go out there. Give them their orders." "And Alistair," he looked back at her. "Do not attempt to be charming," she advised. "Just be the man who pays them." The reconstruction began. The Abbey transformed from a silent mausoleum into a cacophony of progress. The air smelled of sawdust, wet mortar, and sweat. Alistair worked alongside the men. He did not issue orders from horseback. He hauled beams, mixed lime, and climbed the scaffolding. He bled, he bruised, and he drove them relentlessly. The villagers who had spent 5 years whispering about the demonic Duke watched him work himself to exhaustion. Slowly, the whispers changed. A man who hauled timber until his hands bled was not a demon. He was just a man. Beatrice managed the logistics with lethal efficiency. She expanded the kitchen staff, hiring 2 local women to bake the massive loaves of bread needed to feed the crew. She negotiated wholesale prices for salted pork and beans, but the relentless pace took its toll. In late May, the mornings began to blur. Beatrice found herself gripping the edge of her heavy desk, fighting waves of violent nausea that left her cold and trembling. She would quietly lock the antechamber door, empty the contents of her stomach into a porcelain bowl, wash her face with freezing water, and return to her ledgers. She knew the biology of it. She was 24, and she shared a bed with a man who clung to her in the dark, like she was the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. She was pregnant. A rational woman, a joyful woman, would have told her husband immediately. But Beatrice was a creature of pragmatism. She looked at Alistair, who was finally sleeping through the night, who was smiling at the progress of the stonemasons, who was finally believing that the ash of his past could be swept away. A child was a complication. A child required a future, stability, and softness. They barely had a functioning roof over the main hall. She decided to wait. She would tell him when the harvest was in. She would tell him when the perimeter was truly secure. But the perimeter was about to be breached. The carriage that arrived in the second week of July was entirely out of place in the rugged northern landscape. It was painted a glossy midnight blue, the wheels trimmed in gold, pulled by 4 matched greys. It navigated the newly repaired gravel driveway of Westfall Abbey like a peacock wandering into a lumber yard. Beatrice was in the main hall, inspecting the newly laid oak floorboards, when the heavy front doors swung open. Lady Agatha stepped over the threshold, followed closely by a pale, terrified-looking Cecily. Agatha looked exactly the same. Her mourning clothes had been discarded long ago, replaced by a travelling gown of deep emerald silk. She took one look at the scaffolding still clinging to the upper galleries, wrinkled her nose, and then locked her gaze on Beatrice. "Good heavens, Beatrice," Agatha said, her voice dripping with casual disdain. "You look like a scullery maid. Does the Duke not provide you with a dress allowance?" Beatrice stood up slowly. She was wearing a faded cotton day dress, her hands dusted with chalk from marking the floorboards. She felt a cold, familiar stone drop into her stomach. 10 years of conditioning screamed at her to lower her eyes, to make herself small, to apologize. She forced herself to stand perfectly straight. "We are rebuilding, Agatha," Beatrice said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" Agatha sighed, stripping off her kid leather gloves. "Is that any way to greet your mother?" "I have traveled for 5 days through God-forsaken country to check on your welfare. The rumors in London are horrific. They say the Duke has lost his mind entirely and has you living in a barn." "The rumors are outdated," Beatrice replied. "The Abbey is fully solvent. Now answer the question." Agatha's eyes narrowed. The veneer of maternal concern vanished, replaced by the sharp, calculating glint that Beatrice knew too well. "Cecily's season was a disaster," Agatha snapped. "Lord Harrington rescinded his offer. He heard whispers of your husband's reputation. The stigma of the Westfall name has ruined her prospects." Cecily sniffled softly into a lace handkerchief, hovering behind her mother like a frightened ghost. "I fail to see how that is my concern," Beatrice said. "It is your concern because you are my daughter," Agatha hissed, stepping closer. "The 50,000 the Duke paid me barely covered the immediate debts. The creditors are circling again. Cecily needs another season. She needs a dowry to overcome the stench of your marriage. Your husband is a duke. He has vast holdings. I need £1,000, Beatrice. Immediately." Beatrice almost laughed. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand was breathtaking. "You sold me to clear your ledgers. You hold no claim on me, and you certainly hold no claim on Westfall money." "You arrogant little fool," Agatha said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "Do you think you are safe here? Do you think he actually wants you? He bought you because he was too ruined to secure a proper bride. You are a glorified bookkeeper. If I go back to London and confirm that the Duke of Westfall is keeping his wife in squalor, the banks will call in whatever loans he has left. I can ruin him, Beatrice. And I will, unless you fetch his checkbook. You will do absolutely nothing." The voice echoed through the cavernous hall, deep, rough, and vibrating with absolute authority. Alistair descended the newly built oak staircase. He was not wearing a coat. His linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, revealing his heavily scarred forearms. He held a heavy iron hammer in his right hand. He looked like a warlord who had just stepped off a battlefield. Agatha visibly recoiled, her face draining of color as she took in the sheer size of him, and the stark, brutal reality of his ruined face. Alistair did not look at Agatha. He walked straight to Beatrice. He stopped beside her, his massive presence a physical wall between her and her stepmother. He looked down at Beatrice's chalk-dusted hands, then up at her pale face. "Are you unharmed?" he asked softly, ignoring the other two women entirely. "I am fine, Alistair," Beatrice said, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a fraction at the sound of his voice. Only then did Alistair turn his icy grey gaze on Lady Agatha. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You are trespassing," Alistair stated. "I am this girl's mother," Agatha began, trying to muster her London haughtiness, though her voice shook. "You are the parasite who sold her to a monster to pay your gambling debts," Alistair interrupted, his tone lethal. "I know exactly who you are, Lady Agatha. I know your bank, I know your solicitors, and I know that you currently owe £300 to a silk merchant in Cheapside," Agatha gasped, taking a step back. "When I bought your leverage," Alistair continued, taking a slow step toward her, the hammer hanging casually at his side. "I kept the receipts. I still hold the promissory notes on your London townhouse. I did not destroy them. I simply locked them in my desk." He smiled. It was a terrifying expression on his scarred face. It was the smile of a predator. "If you ever speak to my wife in that tone again, if you ever set foot in Northumberland again, if you ever even write her name on a piece of parchment," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a deadly rumble, "I will call in the notes. I will have you evicted. I will have you thrown into Fleet Prison for debt, and I will personally see to it that your daughter works as a scullery maid to pay off your gin tabs." The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the distant sound of hammers outside seemed to stop. Agatha opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Alistair, then at Beatrice. She saw no weakness in either of them. She saw a fortress made of stone and spite. "Cecily," Agatha choked out, "we are leaving." They practically ran to the door. Alistair watched them go, not moving a muscle until the heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. Only then did he drop the iron hammer onto a workbench with a heavy thud. He turned back to Beatrice. The lethal coldness in his eyes melted away, leaving behind a fierce, protective heat. He reached out and gently brushed a streak of chalk from her cheek. "You did not have to threaten her with debtor's prison," Beatrice said quietly, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I would have burned her London house to the ground if she hadn't left," Alistair corrected, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "She is the past, Beatrice. She has no power here. You command this house. You command me." Beatrice looked up into his grey eyes. The man standing before her was not the broken defensive ghost she had met in the library 6 months ago. He was whole. They had put the pieces back together, binding the cracks with iron and ledger ink. The nausea that had been plaguing her all morning suddenly vanished. The fear she had been carrying, the fear that this life was too fragile to sustain anything more, evaporated. "I need to tell you something," Beatrice said, her voice steady. Alistair frowned, his hand dropping to her shoulder. "Did she hurt you? If she touched you, I swear to God—" "No, Alistair, stop!" She took a deep breath. "I am pregnant." Alistair froze. The silence that followed was entirely different from the heavy, hostile silences of winter. This was a stunned, breathless vacuum. He stared at her, his mind clearly struggling to process the data. He looked at her stomach, then back at her face. The color drained from his skin, making the silvery scars on his neck stand out sharply. "Pregnant," he repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "Yes," Beatrice said, suddenly terrified by his stillness. She braced herself for the panic. She'd expected him to remember the fire, to remember the fragility of life, to spiral into the nightmare of bringing a child into a house built on ashes. "I know the timing is not ideal. We still have the South Wing to—" "Beatrice, stop talking about the South Wing," Alistair whispered. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. He didn't pull her into a polite, gentlemanly embrace. He pulled her against his chest with a desperate, crushing force, burying his face in her hair. Beatrice felt the sheer, raw power of the man trembling against her. He was shaking. "A child," he breathed against her ear, his voice breaking. "You are giving me a child." "We are having a child," Beatrice corrected gently, her own arms wrapping tightly around his waist, anchoring him. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were bright, shining with a moisture she had never seen there before. The cynical, brutal Duke of Westfall, the man who had terrified a London solicitor and banished a vicious matriarch without raising his voice, was weeping. He dropped to his knees, right there in the dust and chalk of the main hall. He pressed his face against her stomach, his large, calloused hands gripping her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "I thought I would die in this house," Alistair confessed, his voice muffled against her skirts. "I thought I would just slowly freeze to death, paying off debts to men who hated me, haunted by ghosts I couldn't save. I bought you because I wanted a crowbar." He looked up at her, the tears tracking through the dust on his unscarred cheek. "But you didn't just pry the doors open, Beatrice. You rebuilt the whole damn foundation. You gave me my life back." Beatrice looked down at him. She reached out, her fingers running through his thick, dark hair. She felt a profound, overwhelming warmth flood her chest. It was not a mathematical calculation. It was not a strategic advantage. It was love. Deep, pragmatic, utterly unbreakable love. "We built it together, Alistair," she said softly. "And we are going to need more coal for the nursery." Alistair let out a wet, genuine laugh. He stood up, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, and kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute victory. By December, exactly 1 year after Beatrice had arrived at Westfall Abbey in a freezing carriage, the estate was unrecognizable. The main hall was warm, heated by a massive new hearth that drew perfectly. The East Wing ruins had been cleared away entirely, replaced by a walled garden that would bloom in the spring. The local villagers no longer crossed the street when Alistair rode into town. They tipped their hats to the Duke, who paid fair wages and fixed the roads. Beatrice sat in the library, a heavy wool blanket draped over her lap. Her stomach was round and heavy, resting comfortably beneath her hands. Alistair sat at the mahogany desk across from her. He was not reading ledgers. He was reading a book of poetry. It was a terrible, flowery book, and he read it aloud with a dry, sarcastic monotone that made Beatrice laugh until her ribs ached. He stopped reading and looked up, marking his page with a piece of ribbon. The firelight danced across his face. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked entirely, perfectly at peace. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. "I am roasting, Alistair. If you put another log on that fire, I will have to move to the corridor," Beatrice replied, smiling. He stood up, walked around the desk and knelt beside her chair. He rested a hand on her swollen belly, waiting patiently until he felt the sharp, distinct kick against his palm. His scarred face broke into a gentle, wondrous smile. Lady Agatha had sold Beatrice for £50,000, thinking she was discarding useless weight. She had thought she was sending a plain, tiresome spinster to die in a ruined madman's castle. She had been wrong. Agatha had not sold Beatrice into ruin. She had accidentally handed the most resilient woman in England the keys to a kingdom, and in doing so had given a broken duke exactly what he needed to conquer his ghosts. Beatrice looked at the fire, at the solid stone walls, and finally at the man kneeling beside her. They were safe. The perimeter was secure. The ledgers were balanced. And for the first time in her life, Beatrice stopped calculating the odds of survival and simply allowed herself to live. That brings us to the end of Beatrice and Alistair's story, a tale where survival turned into an empire, and the ultimate revenge was simply building a beautiful life from the ashes. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the cold north, proving that sometimes the most romantic thing a person can be is ruthlessly competent. If this grounded, gritty romance kept you hooked, please hit that like button. It truly helps the channel. Don't forget to share this story with fellow historical drama lovers and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss our next original historical fiction. See you in the next video.